welcome back to Beyond the Veil Tarot and Astrology. My name is Candice Marie. Thanks for joining me. I'll be your astrologer today. Happy Thursday, everybody. Hopefully you guys are doing well. This is going to be a little bit more, a little bit of my astro musing. So this might be a little bit of like a more wild type of video than what I usually do. But I want to give you guys an example of what astrologers really do. Do me a favor, if you guys like my content, you want to see more of it, click the button below, make sure you're subscribed. Even if you thought you were subscribed, you're going to want to make sure you're subscribed after this video, because there's going to be some wild and crazy conspiracy stories in relation to the astrology of the Titanic. Yeah, so make sure you drop me a like, comment, share, subscribe. And, you know, in light of some of the events that have taken place involving this submarine that went missing over the last week or so, and the Titanic being in the news, it's gotten my interest peaked a little bit. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a background on my interest with this particular story. We're going to touch on some of the conspiracies related to the Titanic and why it may have gone down and where some of these things might be actually a little debunked. And then I'm going to also talk a little bit about this recent submarine expedition that went missing. I'm going to tie it all together with the astrology and give you guys some of my hot takes. I got lots of emails from people, lots of people on some of my astrology forums that I belong to. Everybody's been really interested in this particular topic. And I have two things to say, okay? More than two things. You guys know I always have a lot to say. But on one hand, while everybody was talking about the missing submarine, I was secretly fixated and obsessing about the Titanic's chart in itself. So really a lot of the events over the last week or two really kind of spurred me jumping into doing a lot of research, both in terms of finding the date in the chart of when the Titanic itself was created, because in my mind, that's the actual birth of the ship. Looking more into the history of the Titanic, also looking at the chart relating to the Titanic sinking, and tying it all together with some recent events, because we know that history repeats itself. And then I guess my second thing would be, and I have to say this at the head of the video because I'm sure not a lot of people are going to watch this whole video, because I'm going to end up looking like Charlie from Always Sunny, but that's okay. I want to give you guys some key headlines for some things that you have missed while you were distracted by the submarine fiasco. So just some hot takes here. Okay, first of all, we'll get into the chart, but we now know, based off of what the US Navy has said, apparently they believe that the submarine actually imploded the Sunday before the news was released, which was then released on Thursday. So that's interesting that there was like a 4 or 5 day gap in between the time that the news broke. And apparently when they believed just shortly after losing contact with the sub that it may have imploded based off of, I guess, like frequencies they got under the ocean and feedback that they believe could have been it imploding. But while we were not aware of this, there were some really big news headlines that came out in the week. Maybe you guys have seen my videos recently where I've been discussing some of the Neptune squares that would be taking place, and that while we were in the midst of, Gemini season, we were going to see Sun square Neptune and Mercury square Saturn, and like we couldn't, anything coming out of the news basically could not and should not be believed. Well, here's the news that you might have missed, and this is a compiled list of things that I have been noting that's been coming up in independent media, but probably one of the biggest things is that JP Morgan and Jeffrey Epstein emails were released, only to be mistakenly deleted. There was 27 million emails that were wanted for various probes, financial probes, things involving child trafficking and abuse and all kinds of other things, but they mistakenly get deleted, okay? 700 Syrian immigrants die off the coast of Greece, which is rather unfortunate, but we're more consumed with about 5 or 6 individuals that are in a tin can under the sea. Joe Biden is undergoing an impeachment vote in the House, but you may or may not have heard about it. The Pentagon sends yet another $6 billion to Ukraine. Hunter Biden gets off for tax crimes and much more. While FBI whistleblowers go missing, John Durham had congressional hearings regarding the Russia hoax this week. The FDA approves selling fake chicken grown in labs that they do not have to put labels on, and 27 children go missing in Ohio near Cleveland. Smoke and mirrors, right? Kind of convenient that there's some really big things happening. Not that some of this stuff did not make the news, some of it did, but it's not as talked about as the submarine situation. So in light of, yes, those were some people's relatives, some people's family. I'm seeing a lot of really negative things on the internet, some really horrible memes that you guys are going to go to hell for, about these people that were in the submarine that died. And so I'm not saying this to be insensitive. I'm not as consumed about that. I will talk about why I think it happened, and I'm going to give you guys some of my perspectives, because I believe I know when the sub went down. I know that that's kind of a bold statement, but I've kind of worked the chart and I have a theory. But I also feel like this is some really big stuff, and I wonder if this has been intentionally put out during a week where there was going to be some things that the mainstream media did not want to be discussed. So it just conveniently got extended a couple of days to kind of shadow some things that were going on in the world. All right, so essentially, astrologers, we study all different kinds of topics, right? Some of us really want to talk about natal charts. Other people want to give you guys the forecast, and we want to talk about what's going on out in the world. Other astrologers want to study specific planets, particular transits. They specialize in relationship type of astrology. The list goes on. So there's so many different variations of astrology that can be practiced. Probably the biggest thing that I love about astrology is, that once you kind of get the bug, it's like you cannot stop. Whether that's listening to horoscopes or doing research, reading, or learning more about your natal chart. And me personally, I have natal Sun, Mercury, and Pluto conjunct in Scorpio. I like to dig deep into the truth and the facts of situations. I have Jupiter trine Pluto, so I also really want to kind of figure out what is the underlining theme or the lesson or the story in regards to some of these really significant findings. And it gets triggered all the time. So I think that's what kind of keeps me constantly engaged with this practice, and it never gets old. But this is how astrologers learn, right? We research, and generally we find topics or events or things that really interest us, and we connect the dots using astrology. So more or less, I have prepared this. I've worked on this for a little bit before turning it over to you guys, but I did leave room for me to kind of wrap and look at things and actually explore some of this stuff with you guys and unpack it in real time. So that way you get a kind of an idea how astrologers work when we're looking at charts or when we're looking at world events, not necessarily just birth charts, right? We can use astrology for so much more. This is purely just something that kind of piqued my interest. I guess you could say I have a strong personal connection to the Titanic. Not so much, actually. More so because my moon happens to be in the later degrees of the sign of Aries. And I didn't really look at the chart, actually, until probably the last couple of years. But one thing that really kind of caught my interest is the fact that the north node of the sinking event, and I'll show you guys that chart, is 21 degrees. It's right on top of my natal moon. And as you guys know, these eclipses are taking place in Aries. The north node is moving into Aries. So I guess you could say I have a bit of a vested interest. Dare I say a little bit of skin in the game? I know maybe creating such a controversial video could possibly, create a little bit of backlash, but it is what it is. At the very least, hopefully it's slightly entertaining. I think that, I've always been fascinated with that. I have a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. I like sad stories. I like, especially in the sign of Capricorn, I like a good time period piece. And I was always just really captivated by the story of the Titanic and the tragedy of what happened, and also the mystery surrounding the significant people that went down on the ship, and where this wreck may be. You know, whenever I want to get a good laugh or feel old, I just tell people that I'm old enough to have watched the original Titanic movie on 2 VHS tapes. So that should give you an idea of how old I am. Yes, it was rented from Blockbuster, okay? So believe it or not, you had to watch movies sometimes that were rather long on 2 VHSs. And I watched it alone in secret because I wasn't supposed to watch it because I was about 9 years old and there was nudity in the film. I was actually 8 years old when it was released, so I was like around about 9.5 when I first saw the movie. As many of you guys remember, Kate Winslet, right? Leonardo DiCaprio when he was still young and up and coming. The story was amazing and incredibly captivating. And so I have a real personal interest, less in the movie, but more in the actual story behind this. And whether or not the Titanic actually wants to be found, whether or not it actually wants to be seen, if it wants its history to kind of come out now. We're going to talk about some of the transits going on in the Titanic's chart. But first I want to give you guys a little bit of backstory. So just as a note, I'm not a historian, but I have done my due diligence to really go and thoroughly do some research and making sure that I'm getting as credible of information as I can. Obviously, it's been over 110 years since the Titanic sank, and so it can kind of be easy to manipulate or change facts given how long ago this was. But this is primarily based off of research that I've been conducting, but I'm not a historian. All right, with that being said, so let me show you guys the Titanic's chart. And this is really what kind of struck me, because when I was putting this together, first it was just an interest, okay? I was not planning on making a video. First it was just an interest, but I kept looking at the chart of the actual sinking of the Titanic, and it just kind of struck me that was like, that's the event. That's not when the ship was birthed, I guess you would say. So I went a little bit deeper and I went in to go and find the historical records of when the Titanic was first launched. Okay, so not to be confused with when the actual ship departed from Europe to New York. This is when they actually took the massive boat at the time that was built and they push it along, and then they actually get it into the water. So this is the birth of the actual ship. So this took place on May 31st, 1911, and it was at 12:16 p.m. in Belfast. And it's really interesting how I got this info. I went and sought this out. I don't know if somebody else has this chart, but I created it. Apparently, the ship was about to be released around noon, and they said it was 15 minutes prior that the ship was actually pushed off of, I guess, like I don't even know what it would be called, but they pushed it off of, like, let's say, like the dock into the water. And they said that 15 minutes before they did this, there was fireworks. And when the fireworks were over, then they released the ship, I guess. Okay, so whatever. Or there was some kind of like, horns or some kind of celebration. So they do that, and they said that it took approximately 64 or 65 seconds after they pushed it before it hit water. So I came up with 12:16 p.m. and this was in Belfast, UK, also known as Northern Ireland. So that's going to give you like let's say like the birth chart of the ship itself. So that's a Virgo rising, Sun in Gemini, and Moon in Cancer. So obviously the Titanic, known as the unsinkable ship, right? It didn't actually set sail, though, until closer to April 15th, 1912. And actually, no, I take that back. It left Southampton on April 10th, 1912, with 2,240 passengers between crew and board. Several days later, on April 15th, 1912, it struck an iceberg, and it broke apart and sank to the bottom of the ocean just off of Newfoundland, I guess, like up by like Canada. So it's way up there in those icy waters. But taking the lives of more than 1,500 passengers and crew with them. Okay, so you guys know the story of the Titanic. I don't need to get too much into it. But yeah, I think it's interesting, especially considering the fact that the Titanic's passenger list included some of the creme de la creme of the 20th century business culture and high society from both sides of the Atlantic. And we're going to talk about some of those people. But what not many people know is that there's a lot of like conspiracy. There's like a lot of like people who believe these stories about why the Titanic sank, if it was, you know, a whole series of things. And I'm going to kind of talk about that and see if we can debunk some of that stuff today with astrology. So for starters, some of the biggest conspiracies that you're going to hear is that it happened because somebody wanted it to sink because they had a vested interest in something going on pertaining to the Titanic. I've heard all kinds of stuff. Some people want to blame the Rothschilds. Some people want to blame JP Morgan. It is true, and we'll get into this in a second, that JP Morgan was directly tied to the Titanic. However, he was not on the ship at the time that it sank. I've heard other stories about a cursed mummy in the cargo where people claim that there was like a mummy that was supposed to be transported from originally from Egypt, and then part of like the casket was in the UK, and it was sold to an archaeologist, and it was supposed to be taken to New York because originally the Titanic made about 2 stops before venturing to New York. Anyway, that kind of got debunked. Apparently that's a mummy that stayed for a while in the UK and then eventually made its way to Australia. But there's a bunch of stories behind that. You know, people were saying that like they opened up the caskets and the people who originally found the mummies had a bunch of like bad luck, and that they were blaming that on the Titanic. So I can tell you, I did my research and we can debunk that. There's also been talks in regards to swapping of the ships for insurance fraud. So just to make a long story short, when the Titanic came out, there were several ships that were like sister ships that were similar. But basically on the hull and various parts of the ship, you're gonna find like almost like a serial number that's going to tell you like which ship is which. And it's been confirmed from looking at the Titanic that's now at the bottom of the ocean that that is the same number which correlates to the Titanic's numbers. So I personally don't believe that that's true. There might be some people that, you know, argue that. There was talk that these sister ships supposedly like had some kind of issue and they wanted to swap the ships and make it seem like that was the Titanic and have another boat on standby, so if they needed for whatever to like help people, if there was a problem, they would be close and then they could cash in on an insurance claim. But essentially, it wouldn't have made sense because apparently the Titanic cost somewhere around $7 million to build, and it would have paid out only about $5 million. Now, some would argue that losing $2 million versus $7 million would be a whole lot better, but I don't know, that's neither here nor there. And then people were, you know, continuing to kind of raise suspicion revolving around JP Morgan. Now, once again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm just connecting the dots to some things that I find interesting in where the Titanic sinking really did financially benefit JP Morgan in the long run. It ended up being something that really kind of helped some of his financial goals and has more or less probably helped him and that company now, that banking company, come to the power that they withhold today. Now, JP Morgan technically owned the Titanic, okay? So if you do some research and you go and you look into it, he owned a sub company which owned like the White Star Line, that was the company of all of the ships that were developed. And I find it really interesting that JP Morgan dropped out apparently. Some people say days prior, some people say the day before he was supposed to make the trek to New York City. Some people also suggest that he was financially and politically motivated by, you know, the fact that he wanted to get rid of some of his financial and political rivals which were on board. JP Morgan was one of the biggest proponents for creating a Federal Reserve, which led to the, you know, today's private bank, the Federal Reserve. This is the bank that lends out money to the government, and they believed very heavily in that day that we should have that, that it would prevent bank runs. It would also allow the Federal Reserve to be in charge, that it could keep us from having depressions. Which was a pretty big talking point back then. If you know, we weren't alive, but if you go back and you look at history, in the 1800s, bank runs had become quite a political issue and a huge talking point. So the late 1800s into the 1900s, it was just kind of like, well, what can we do to prevent this from happening? So that way we were making sure that banks aren't running out of money. Who can we elect or put in charge that can, manage all of this? Now, nowadays, you guys hear Federal Reserve and you assume that they're automatically connected to the federal government, and they are not. They are a private bank. And many millionaires and businessmen back in the day were not necessarily for this because they saw the potential of not having control over their funds or their resources. Now, there was a point in history where JP Morgan actually had more money than the US government. Very, very, very wealthy man. Nowadays, we know it as JP Morgan Bank and Financial Associations. And he had conflict with apparently 3 different individuals. Now, in fairness, I've heard differing opinions or, like stories in relation to this. Some people suggest that John Jacob Astor, Ben Guggenheim, and Mr. Strauss, the 3 millionaires that were on board, were against the Federal Reserve and essentially were very vocal about it and were very involved in discussing that they didn't want this coming to fruition, which posed an issue for JP Morgan because he wanted that to happen. He had a vested interest in that. He wanted to kind of oversee the people who were going to be involved in that. If you go back and you look at your history, you'll find that there was a point where JP Morgan was heavily involved in helping kind of bail the government out. And more or less, I think, kind of negotiating a deal, ironically, a year after the Titanic sinks, to be able to kind of start setting up like the chair, which would eventually be the Federal Reserve. Now, some historians I have read were like, well, 2 of the 3 guys on board weren't so for it, but we don't really know how one of them stood. So we can't say all of them were against it and that it was an inside job. That's a pretty big accusation to make, especially considering the fact that there were thousands of people on board. The weather that was going on at the night of the iceberg that was struck on the 15th was gnarly. You could barely see anything. Apparently, when they were just about to hit the iceberg, it was right when they saw it. So there wasn't enough time to react, and they ended up like backpedaling or turning the pedals of the boat to try to like sway the ship so they would miss it. And there is talk now that that's probably what actually ended up causing them to slow down and hit it, and that it may not have been the right maneuver. Anyway, basically all of these elites that were on this ship were heading to New York City from the UK. And, like I said, JP Morgan owned a company who owned the White Star Line, who was directly connected to the Titanic. Supposedly, a day before the ship departed, JP Morgan falls ill and claims that he can't go, only to be seen out shopping around town in Europe with a lady friend. The question is, did he know something? That's what makes me wonder. I'm kind of like in shock and awe that we have a similar situation where the Titanic takes the lives of several people, several of which are billionaires, not millionaires. And I'm wondering how that benefited JP Morgan in the midst of the news in really kind of overshadowing what potential financial crimes they're responsible for and making those emails disappear. Now, something that also I didn't know, and I wouldn't consider myself like a Titanic buff, but I've had, my fair share of research on it over the years. I didn't know that there supposedly is a well-documented fire that was on the Titanic prior to the Titanic even leaving for its destination in New York City. So apparently there was a massive fire in the coal room, and you guys have to understand, this ship was run completely on coal. Supposedly there was like 3 stories. There was a room 3 stories high just filled with coal, and they're supposed to be pulling the coal out and feeding it into the fire to get all the way, in the engine room, all the way to their destination across the Atlantic. So that's a lot of coal. And apparently some of the sources say there was a coal fire just prior to leaving that they couldn't completely put out. And that they knew that that was there, and at that point they couldn't really go in and out of it, that they just had to focus on like departing and leaving, and that it was like this unsaid thing. There's other people who speculate and say that there was a fire which created some issues with the actual like front of the ship and that it affected like the integrity of the ship. And some accounts say that there was even a large black streak on the front of the ship from the fire. Now, what's even weirder is that when I dug into this, I learned that apparently it was not unusual for there to be inspections for ships of that size to take anywhere from like 2 to 3 weeks, because at that time, I mean, like, it was unheard of. The size of the ship, how many people it could accommodate, so all of the various levels and the machinery and everything that they were going to have to take a look at. So it would be a pretty invasive inspection. But supposedly the inspection for the Titanic was a mere several hours long and completely skipped the engine room only to pass inspection. Okay, seems a little weird. Apparently also most of the crew who worked on specifically the engine portion of the ship refused to join the voyage due to safety concerns. So it's documented supposedly that everybody except for one individual quit and refused to work in the engine room or stay on the ship, citing that there was safety concerns, which is also like a bit weird considering the economic state of what was going on in 1912. Jobs were hard to come by, and especially ones like this, which were dangerous and very physically demanding, paid decently. I'm not going to say well, but it paid decent. And then the icing on the cake is, a year after the Titanic sinks, and we know that there was some kind of, insurance payout, whether or not money was lost, that's neither here nor there. Then we see the Federal Reserve Act passes. Some speculate largely because there was very little opposition from some of the people who died on the ship who would have posed a threat had they made it to their ultimate destination of New York City. So I don't know. I mean, seems kind of weird. So I want to show you guys first the launch of the Titanic chart. So Sun in Gemini, Moon in Cancer, we've got that 17 degrees Virgo rising. Mercury obviously is the ruler of the chart, and Mercury is in the 9th house in conjunction to Saturn. Well, Saturn has associations obviously with limits, with boundaries, anything in regards to machines. And there's no coincidence right now that we have Jupiter that is transiting these particular degrees, okay? So I would consider this, like I said, the Titanic's like birth chart. We're gonna see Jupiter retrograde over these degrees several times this year, so I think it's gonna be bringing awareness to ultimately where there's a lot of similarities. I have had a ton of people email me, but it's something that I actually read and I was like shocked when it kind of like put 2 and 2 together. But James Cameron, obviously the director associated with the movie The Titanic, was talking about just the uncanny similarities, right? Of the fact that, apparently the captain of the ship was receiving like word to be careful, to be mindful, that there could potentially be issues or accidents or things pertaining to hitting icebergs, and yet he forged ahead. And similarly in the situation with the submarine, not many people realize, but the submarine was actually delayed. There was supposedly really bad weather. They got delayed a whole day, then they set out to go in the morning and they got delayed another couple hours. So they were aware that there were some problems very early, apparently before the submarine launch. There was somebody who bailed and they were like, no, I'm not gonna partake. I think I'm good. So also eerily similar to the Titanic. And I think the reason why there is like a lot of stuff coming up about this right now is because we're seeing some activations. Just recently, the Titanic had its nodal return. So that was at 9 degrees. And we see that Jupiter is in conjunction to the south node. So that can represent like a significant loss. And we have planets on the south node and planets on the north node. And so with Mercury and Saturn in conjunction, like limits and issues revolving around international travel, we ironically don't see really too many harsh aspects. There's a number of sextiles that we have to the moon and Venus and Neptune. We also have sextiles to Mars. We're starting to kind of slightly pick up some squares, but probably one of the biggest aspects is Uranus in a square to the nodes. It is within, about 10 degrees, but it's there. And right now we've got Pluto at 29 degrees sitting on the Titanic's Uranus, okay? 29 degrees of Capricorn. And the nodes are coming into a square right now. So it's reinforcing something revolving around the drama, maybe the history, the unexpected circumstances involving maybe vested interests in the Titanic. And Uranus rules the 6th house of accidents. So, you know, Pluto's been there just briefly the last couple of months, but, you know, there's some connection there to that retrograde and it kind of collectively waking everybody up. At the same time, we've got transit Neptune coming into conjunction with Mars in Pisces in the late degrees. And so I think this is where you're seeing a lot of like the conspiracy, especially on social media. People talking about, well, this is what I think, and here's my theory, and here's this, and here's that. But there can be some truth to some of this stuff, especially when you guys start to see some of these other charts that I'm going to be kind of putting together for you. So there's nothing necessarily off the bat that when I look at this chart strikes me and makes me go, oh, you know, like this was doomed for failure. Certainly the Mars square Pluto aspect is probably one of the most like glaring, dangerous aspects in the chart. Mars in the sign of Pisces, which is about the ocean. It's in the 7th house, which does deal with conflict and other people, and also secret sabotage. That's something that comes with Mars in Pisces in the 7th house, especially because Mars is the 8th house lord of death. And it's in a square to Pluto in Gemini, okay? So 10th house Pluto is powerful people, things revolving around, yeah, people who are in charge. Let's just leave it at that. People who are in charge, powers. And the Mars square Pluto makes me feel like it can also be something that's very attractive for powerful people, people who want to potentially be seen in connection to it, especially with Mars being in the 7th house. So we've got some stuff that's like activating Mars on transit Neptune conjunct Mars, and then Neptune square Pluto. And so I think it's like, in a way, kind of like, you know, capturing everybody's like attention with some of the transits. But we're going to hear more about the Titanic pretty much all year long. I think it's going to get a lot of exposure. There's going to be a lot more media. I also think that we're going to hear a lot about legal related things and lawsuits pertaining to protecting it, whether or not people can visit it. I kind of have a hunch that this may start a whole other string of you know, limitations to like who can go there, who can dive, you know, what are the certifications revolving around being in that area, whether or not it's going to be kind of roped off or it's going to be, you know, something that's protected. Technically, it is like in international waters, so it's also something that's kind of hard to navigate in terms of like locking it down and not allowing divers or teams to kind of go there. So I think that's going to be something that's going to be hard to do. All right, so I want to show you guys the chart of the Titanic sinking, and this is the April date. So between May of 1911 and spring of 1912, the Titanic went and had to do a series of like test runs. It was obviously touted as like one of the safest ships out there, but kind of building back off of the issue with like the coal fire. It makes me wonder if there was issues, like I said, with the integrity of the ship, and if JP Morgan knew that there was a problem, and maybe that's why he like decided not to, you know, actually go on the voyage. He decided to kind of stay back. Not because I think he intentionally had something planned or had something up his sleeve, but if he knew that there was either potentially an existing coal fire that was burning, or that the ship integrity was potentially rocked a little bit and it could be dangerous, but he figured, you know what, it's probably going to be fine. There's lots of accounts also from, you know, people talking about how they originally assumed that when the iceberg hit the ship, that it would be fine because it was brand new, it was strong, everything was like really kind of solid in terms of its build, that it should have supposedly withstood that particular blow, but it didn't because it already had issues pertaining to the fire. So I'm wondering if that's like, if there's any truth to that. So here's the actual sinking of the Titanic. This is April 15th, 1912 at 2:38 a.m. That gives it a Sagittarius rising with the sun in the sign of Aries and the moon in the sign of Pisces. Now, I did some digging. I went and looked at specific constellations and lore relating to constellations, trying to see if there was anything that cropped up that was going to paint a picture in regards to the ultimate fate of the Titanic. Now, the reason why I say that is because for me, the fourth house is the ends of situations. I see that as burial or beneath the sea, a graveyard, a resting place. Traditionally, that's how we see the fourth house. Now, I'm looking at this from Placidus, not from whole sign, but from Placidus' perspective, we have the North Node at 21 degrees of Aries conjunct the IC, the Sun, and also Mercury, which is retrograding back into conjunction with the Sun. So this is where I'm going to kind of conspiracy out on you guys a little bit. My hot take on this is, and we'll get into kind of Jupiter as well, because Jupiter does play a role in this in the 12th house. When I look at all these planets conjunct the IC, it's about the end of the story, okay? And how that's so significant and how that's really important. So with the North Node and the 8th house Lord conjunct the IC, was it meant to be at the bottom of the ocean, right? Was it? Now the dispositor of all this is Mars, and you've got a debilitated Mars in Cancer. So did somebody else want this at the bottom of the ocean? That's what I'm wondering. Was it, somehow an attack? I don't know. I think that when we look at some of the other aspects, like the moon in Pisces, even if we looked at this from whole sign perspective, that moon in Pisces at the bottom of the chart in a square to Jupiter, and also making a square to Pluto, also makes me feel like there was somebody who had a vested interest that would potentially want this ship at the bottom of the ocean. Now, I can't speak for the Titanic, but I wonder if this is also an indication that once it's there, it's meant to be left alone. When I digged into the particular constellations, especially at 21 and 48 minutes of Aries, there is a star that's called Beta Kaitos, K-A-I-T-O-S, Kaitos, which specifically correlates with isolation, depression, accidents, immigration, shipwrecks, and it's unfortunate. It's connected to the energy of Saturn. So interesting that we have that there at the bottom of the chart in a hard angle to Neptune, which is quite literally about the sea. Even if this were a whole sign chart, that would put Neptune in the 8th house that was going to be squaring that. Okay, so what else do I see in this chart? We've got the chart Lord Jupiter sitting in the 12th house. It is in that hard aspect to Chiron, so obviously it can talk about lessons revolving around grief and loss, and that particularly of valuable goods to the ocean. We see the Mercury retrograde in conjunction to the Sun, and it's right about at a Cazimi point, which is really interesting because this is that moment right as something was changing direction and a message was being relayed to the king. But in this case, the Sun rules the 8th house, so it's about investments, it can be about insurance, it can be about death, okay, 8th house. But Mercury is involved as well. And I think this is about relaying information that's like the ship has sunk, it's done, people are dead, like we have to leave, like, don't go there, don't mess with it, leave it alone. Some conspiracy theorists I have heard, and it wasn't worth mentioning in the beginning, but have speculated also that some of the passengers, upon being interviewed when they were rescued, said that they didn't hear anything, they didn't see, an iceberg, that actually there was explosions that they were hearing, and then all of a sudden the ship begins to split and one side goes up and then it was starting to sink. Now, obviously, you've got things that are combustible in a ship, right? Coal, fire, gases, electrical. So we can't go as far as saying that, for sure that was a possibility, but I wouldn't rule it out. It does make me wonder if there was intentionally some kind of fire-related incident that was meant to make it look like there was actually like a problem at sea, and then, the ship hit something and it went under. But they could have actually been relating to something else, and that somebody, once again, Mercury Cazimi, had a vested interest. Now, why is the Titanic sinking getting a lot of attention right now? When we throw the transits on top of this chart, there's definitely some stuff going on. Now, this is a Jupiter ruled chart, so it's going to get hit pretty significantly when there's really prominent Jupiter transits. Just recently, Jupiter's gone through the sign of Aries, and now it's moved on to Taurus. We're going to see very soon the North and the South Node are going to change signs. So it's going to come into conjunction with Mercury and the Sun here pretty soon, later in the fall. And it's going to get triggered with the eclipses. So I would be on the lookout, especially like September, October, because I do think that's when we're going to be hearing more in regards to stuff, you know, involving the Titanic or perhaps even the sub that sank. And then we're going to see that the North Node is going to return to its 21 degrees, which looks like that's going to be happening in the new year. So that's going to be closer to like right around the end of December, beginning of January. And that'll be that hard realignment. Even though, you know, obviously this is relating to an event, it may bring more up in regards to this. And when that happens, we're going to see a Mercury retrograde on the ascendant involving Mars in oppositions to Pluto. So I'm wondering if it's almost like I said, history repeating itself and information coming out in the media where really they're drawing the public's interest psychologically on all of the correlations and the connections between what happened with the Titanic and what's happening with these millionaires, when in reality, it's more smoke and mirrors, right? I think it's going to definitely be more smoke and mirrors. Now, we've also got Neptune, which is in conjunction to the moon here. And I think that's also partially why you're hearing a lot about it on the news and on the media. It can be quite captivating and obviously like really can catch the attention of people, especially the connection to the fact that there was, you know, not as much discussed, I think, because it doesn't really fit the narrative of wanting to like celebrate that there's billionaires at the bottom of the sea. But one of the men who were there was there with his 19-year-old son. So this is like how maybe we relate to this on an emotional level in regards to family. And I think the moon Neptune can definitely create a lot of like fantasy and like illusions and also once again conspiracy revolving around this topic. And Neptune will be in a square with Pluto for quite some time. So I definitely think that it can play into other people's best interest in trying to kind of keep people, you know, kind of distracted a little bit while there's other things that are going on. But I'm curious to see what's kind of coming up at the end of the year in regards to this stuff and whether or not Saturn continuing to move through Pisces, hitting Chiron next year, and eventually Saturn and Neptune might be where some parts of the ocean are eventually, I think, going to be off limits. So you may see something similar to like what we've seen in Antarctica. You know, not many people know, but like not many people can go there. It's generally like an off-limit zone. I personally believe that extraterrestrials are out there. I connect aliens more to Neptune than I do to Uranus because it's about other creatures and other places and other beings and other, you know, yeah, other places. I mean, whether you believe in other dimensions or other planets, I think that aliens have been here for some time. I think they're under the ocean. I think that they are and have been there. And I think that a lot of human origins is somehow connected to extraterrestrial beings. Whether that's their involvement in human design or it's them hopefully helping liberate all of us here and reminding us of where we come from and also helping us reconnect to all of the ancient technology and things that we seem to have lost. Now, I do think there's a vested interest also in not allowing some of this stuff to become mainstream news. Although you are hearing a lot about aliens right now, I don't really think it's the way that I'm talking about it. I think it's more being kind of brought up in a way that's like scary and shocking and, you know, something that's not safe, when personally I believe the next couple of years it's going to be really important to have disclosure and to talk about this and also start discussing if they're actually trying to make contact and if they're trying to help the people of this planet spiritually kind of like free ourselves and free our minds. But I do think that there is an interest in wanting to keep that from happening because, well, organized religion would definitely have a problem with that. But secondly, also, how that may really show a lot of people that there's way more to our origins than we believed, that we may potentially have extraterrestrial connection, that we may have extra abilities, that we may all be kind of connected in some way. But more importantly, I think a lot of it's going to be about the technology and the fact that there could be technologies out there that could free the human race, whether it's energy or healing capabilities, things that would allow us to be able to travel to other places in the universe. I think that that is all there, but they're wanting to kind of withhold that. So I speculate whether or not we're going to see a lot of events involving machines in the ocean that's going to kind of break down as a means to limit who can go and explore and who can go and see more. But certainly Saturn retrogrades are about testing our limits as well. And there's definitely something to be said about Saturn going retrograde, and it went in through the sign of Pisces, which is the ocean. And now suddenly we're testing our limits when it comes to the strength and durability of machines. I think that's just to put it very simply. It's not unusual when we hear with a Saturn retrograde that something like this happens in the world. It's just happening in this fashion because it was in the sign of Pisces. Now, when the retrograde happened, it was making a sextile to Jupiter, and Jupiter and the North Node in Taurus do talk about very wealthy individuals. So I'll get more into that in just a second. But speaking of wealthy individuals, I did want to take a look at our friend JP Morgan. I did pull his chart because I got very, very curious about him. And his birthday was April 17th, 1837 at 3 a.m. and that was in Hartford, Connecticut. What were the words that JP Morgan said so famously? Millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. So what did JP Morgan know exactly, right? What did he know? That's something that I keep asking myself. Did he know something that we didn't? He's an Aquarius rising. He's got a stellium of planets in the sign of Aries, and his moon is in Virgo. Well, just looking at his chart in general, I mean, obviously looking at that stellium of really focusing on being like self-made, I'm not surprised, especially with his Sun and Mercury conjunction. I do think he was extremely intuitive. You have to be that successful and to be that wealthy. Uranus as the ruler, Uranus on the ascendant, so he was very Uranian, and that moon in Virgo in his 7th house. The connections to the charts start to become very obvious when I lay them together. And I'm not going to suggest whether or not JP Morgan did it or didn't do it, because the fact is we don't know, we're not going to know. But I do feel like there is some connections to the company in itself benefiting from some of the same horrors that took place when the Titanic sank. Now, when I lay these charts together, and actually let's take a look. This I haven't looked at yet. Let's look at the day that the Titanic sank, because I do want to look at his transits that day. Okay, disregard the time. I'm not worried so much about the time. So we've got here Pluto and Mars. We're moving through his 5th house. We have Saturn, that's in Taurus. So Mercury was retrograding over his Sun. So that could be about him receiving a message. And I wonder if it was about him intuitively being like, I have no business being on this ship. We got the moon that was in his 2nd house, and it was going to swing through here and create a new moon. So it looks like it would have just been on his birthday or round about his birthday that this would have happened within 2 days. South Node in his 8th. I mean, nothing here that's too remarkable. I mean, I'm sure there's something, but there's nothing here that makes me go like, oh yeah, no. Mercury does rule his 8th house of money owed, and Neptune rules his possessions, as does Jupiter. So you've got some Jupiter trine Venus and Pluto. And even if he did end up losing when it comes to the insurance of the actual like ship sinking, when you think about how much money JP Morgan made ultimately by playing a lead role in helping be involved in the federal banks and like setting up the central banks and like seeing all of that go through, obviously did play out for him in the long run, right? Just food for thought. Nothing too interesting here for me, to be honest with you guys, other than the fact that, yeah, within about 48 hours of this, he kind of realized the true, you know, potential opportunities he was going to have financially and also in terms of communication power as a result of this unfortunate event. But really what I'm getting at is his chart with that of the Titanic sinking. And this is where I started kind of putting the pieces together, and I was like, there's got to be something here. So on the inside chart, this is the Titanic sinking event. On the outside is JP Morgan's transits. And so one of the big things, obviously, that caught my eye was the fact that his stellium of planets moves to the IC. So, you know, Sun and Mercury, and the fact that his Venus is conjunct, you know, the North Node in the Sun. I don't think that JP Morgan set out to be like, yeah, I'm going to own all of these like ocean, you know, companies and these boats and this and that. Like, once again, I don't think it was an elaborate plan. I think that he perhaps knew, once again, that there was something possibly wrong with the ship. And I think the Kazemi taking place was a prime example that he was just like, yeah, no, like I don't have a good feeling about it. I'm not going to do it. But also the fact that he may have actually known that there was something wrong. And I really strongly do feel that. We also look at some of his placements in Titanic's sinking chart in the 8th house. And he's got his Mars and his Jupiter. So obviously he's got something that he can gain from this. I do feel like it could be more popular with other people in regards to his sway when it comes to investments and financing. Obviously, 100 years later, all of us can agree with that. We've also got the fact that he has some of his natal placements in Aries that's in a square to the Mars. So even if he did have something to do with it, those truths would lay at the bottom of the ocean. We wouldn't know. I can't tell you how much I know about the exploration of the Titanic, but I wonder that if there is any potential truth to any of this, and they were able to get in there and explore and see whether or not there was any proof that there could have potentially been something else that took place other than an iceberg, it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to kind of put two and two together and realize, wow, so many, you know, prominent people died on the ship. It could have majorly impacted the course of US banking and global banking. And was there something kind of funny going on? And I do feel like, you know, this was not meant to be something that was going to be explored. And I can see that clear as day looking at the Titanic chart. I think with all those planets, you know, at the bottom of the IC makes me feel like anybody who's going to go down there and try to explore is going to go down with the ship, right? Pun intended. Heck, look at the movie The Titanic, right? Everybody's down there. They're looking for this the heart of the ocean or whatever that, you know, big gaudy necklace is. Nobody can find it. The old lady walks out in the middle of the night, dumps it, and then she dies. She goes down with the ship. To me, this feels like those who go looking for the treasure or so fixated on the treasure ultimately end up getting swallowed up by the, let's just say, the spirits. I mean, I don't want to speak for the spirits, but you get what I'm saying. Especially considering like the North Node is something that is very mysterious and magical and foggy in nature. The fact that the sun, and that's the 8th house lord, is involved makes me feel like it's literally like sucking people in, especially people who are willing to take risks, Aries, explorers, you know, and people who are just really intensely interested in being able to get in there and be the first, right? All right, so let me get back to my notes here. So we talked a little bit about that, how, you know, he drops out, the involvement with the other guys who were supposedly against the central banking. let's talk a little bit now more about the OceanGate Titan submarine. Okay, so now we're gonna fast forward a little bit. So recently, over this last week, those of you guys who are not aware, you must live under a rock. But this past week, we've heard about this particular Titan submersible going missing. It was roughly 22 feet long, and it was going down with a group of explorers to view the wreckage of the Titanic. Now, the craft went missing. It only had so many hours of oxygen, and it pretty much has taken the entire world, you know, captive with all of the storylines and the things that have been going on. The reason why I don't have a specific chart is I couldn't find out when the Titan was originally first launched. Couldn't find that info. The only chart that I'm going to be showing you guys is going to be the actual day and time that we lost contact with the Titan. Okay, so you can go online. I went on Al Jazeera. I went and confirmed everything. I looked at the timeline of the events, and I'll give you guys a little bit of background on that in just a second. Now, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people that went missing on the submarine. We had British businessman and explorer Hamish Harding, who's also like a pilot. He's got a ton of Guinness World Records. He recently is known for going up in space with Jeff Bezos. And yeah, he's got a background in working with Arab Emirates, I think. And so he obviously was on board. Then we have British Pakistani businessman, I think his name is Shahzada. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it. It's Shahzada Dawood. And he was originally supposed to go with his wife, but his wife was like, "Nah, I'm not gonna go. I'll let you take our 19-year-old son." So they went together, and his name was Salman. Now, this particular individual, interesting, is the vice chair of Engro Corporation. Now, if you don't know who Engro is, they focus on mergers and acquisitions of textiles, fertilizers, food, and energy in public listed companies. Recently, he's been recognized and named as a young global leader with the World Economic Forum and a speaker at the United Nations. Okay, I don't need to say more than that. Just do with that what you will. Then finally, we had French explorer Paul Henry, and he's got a French last name that I cannot pronounce, but I want to say it's Nargeolet. Now, he's well known because he considers himself a Titanic expert. He has been exploring the Titanic for years. He's gone on previous expeditions. And then finally, we have the pilot and the OceanGate CEO, Stockton Rush. So this is the individual who runs this particular company. Maybe you guys have seen him recently all over the news, making comments about how he was steering the ship with a game controller, and was talking about and kind of boasting about that there were certain tricks and things that he did to kind of like jimmy rig things on the sub. And it seemed a little weird because some people had speculated that some of it kind of seemed like it did not make sense to be holding the sub together, or that there were things that were being used that made it seem like unsafe, okay? And he's gotten dragged all through social media for that. There's like videos that have emerged of him talking about it and almost joking about the fact that he wasn't supposed to have certain materials on the sub, but he did. Now, something that really caught my eye, big time, is the fact that, you know, Saturn is a sign, or excuse me, is a planet that deals with integrity, boundaries, limits. It also deals with older people. It deals with people who are elders or who are experienced, okay? So I found some footage, and I watched it and I listened to the lecture, and it was of Stockton Rush, the guy who was the CEO of OceanGate, who was giving like a lecture, and he was like talking about putting together this team for this particular dive. They've been working on this for years. It's something that they've had very few people go down in, but in terms of bringing actual civilians down there, it's a completely different ball game. But in some of the audio that I was listening to, he mentioned several times that the company was pushing for diversity. And the OceanGate CEO gave an interview regarding the future of their employees, saying that he didn't want to continue to keep hiring ex-military or ex-mariners who were 50-year-old white guys. That there are other submarine operators out there, and wanted a younger, more inspirational team that was more diverse. Now, before you guys get all woke on me, I don't have a problem with that, okay? You want to be a lady submarine diver? I hope you do it in a safe and orderly fashion. I don't have a problem with diversity in general, especially in regards to fields where it may benefit from diversity. However, what's concerning to me is that he almost made it sound like he wanted to do it because it would make the whole dive more marketable. In recent months, we've also seen for this company that they've gone and hired like a female TikToker to like start doing all their social media and promoting all their stuff. And they thought it would like kind of drive more interest if they have people who have more of a public platform that are involved with their particular company. Now, apparently, of some of the positions which they wanted to out some of these older white 50-year-old guys were directly linked to safety and risk assessment. He said anyone can, potentially get in here and learn how to do this. And oh, by the way, I can do this with a game controller. Like, this is not a joke. Go and look at it online. It's like wild to me. Ex-Marine operation position. A man who was holding the ex-Marine operations position was apparently fired in 2018 for sounding the alarm on issues with safety. Now, he noted reports with serious concerns over materials within the sub and raised risk of potential catastrophe. And these were communicated to the top and eventually even the CEO, but he was still fired for sounding the alarm. So what does this tell me? Right? Saturn retrograde. We're looking back and reevaluating where something was not adequately put together, where it lacked integrity, where it lacked physical capability. I don't know what you guys know, but it was essentially sealed from the outside in. And it was going to have to dive down, I think it was like 2.5 hours or so, just to be able to even reach the Titanic. And they knew that it was going to potentially be round about a 6-hour trip, but that it only had a certain maximum capacity of like so much air, okay? So it's like, it kind of seemed like it was a recipe for disaster to begin with, but people still did it, and they signed these waivers saying that they understood that there could potentially be major injuries, emotionally, physically, psychologically, or even death, yet they still went. So you've got all these like wealthy people going to the bottom of the ocean to go and look at this wreckage. Like I said, when we look at the series of events in terms of how this kind of played out, they were supposed to, so they left on the 16th, Friday, June 16th, that's when they left to start the expedition. They started heading out to the ocean, getting ready to drop the sub. Apparently, they were supposed to go out on the 17th and actually start the expedition, but the weather was really bad. They were basically kind of trying to decide whether or not they were going to launch, and they still decided to launch on June 18th, 2023. However, they ended up having a several-hour delay with their launch, and then they eventually start their descent at 8:00 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, apparently, it was going to take about, like I said, 2.5 hours to get to that point where they were going to be able to start seeing the wreckage of the Titanic. But right around 9:45 a.m., so about an hour and 45 minutes into the descent, they lost communications with the sub, okay, completely. There was no connection, and yeah, it was like that for several days. Now, obviously, the media was kind of making more, comments about this on Thursday the 22nd. So we had Sundays when they lost connection. It wasn't until Thursday that's like, oh, they're about to run out of oxygen. The sub's not going to have enough oxygen. We're sending out search and rescue. We're looking for them. We're trying to find them. There's only so much supply of air, and supposedly it was only 96 hours from the time that it was sealed. And this information was coming out the morning of June 22nd, okay? So Then the afternoon at 3 p.m. on the 22nd, debris was found that was consistent with the loss of pressure of the chamber of the sub. And obviously no survivors were found because they're suggesting that because of pressure, it potentially imploded. And also there were materials on the sub. So it was very unlikely that there was going to be any human remains found. Sorry, trigger warning, but nothing was really going to be found because of the pressure and the way that the sub would have potentially imploded. But they started finding debris near the wreck of the Titanic. Okay, so it goes missing. It gets dropped on Sunday. We hear nothing about it until Thursday. Then on Friday the 23rd, just hours, we hear from the Navy that just hours after the sub's journey, the Navy detected sounds consistent with an implosion. After days of searching for the submarine, the Ocean Atlantic, as it transported these 5 people, basically they're like, it's no longer a mystery. They're suggesting that the sound is more or less confirming that the sub itself actually imploded the same day that it got dropped on Sunday. But we didn't hear about it until Thursday. Okay, so they're saying that the military detected an acoustic abnormality consistent with an implosion. Search and rescue teams did not find anyone. As of right now, I'm filming this on the 26th. Deep sea robots are trying to recover any remains of the sub. So I don't have a chart for you, basically. That's the long and short of it. I don't have a chart. I do have when they lost contact, and from what I have found looking at multiple news sources, everybody has said the same thing. They have all said it was a short amount of time after it started its initial descent that apparently they lost contact, and now they're saying that they believe it was that same day that the sub may have potentially imploded. So this gives us June 18th, 2023, 9:45 a.m. Off St. John's in Canada, a 21-degree Leo rising, sun in Gemini, moon in Cancer, okay? So is this the actual chart of the sinking? No, I mean, unless there's some information that comes out, and there's going to be some stuff that's going to come out. I'm very confident that when we start to see aspects to Saturn, we're going to hear more about this. I'm also pretty sure we're going to hear more about this right around the holidays, even if it's more relating to the involvement of the Titanic wreckage and protecting it. We're still going to hear more. Anyway, so this gives us a Leo rising chart, and it was just after the new moon that was in Cancer. And if you guys remember correctly, the new moon that was in Gemini, it was in a square to Neptune. Okay, so we were already like, where is this thing? This thing is missing. Like, what's going on? And none of us knew, or maybe we knew that they were getting ready to make this launch. There is part of my rational brain that goes, okay, but did anybody see this launch? Like, where is the evidence that we saw this launched? I know that we're hearing all kinds of stories in regards to the families relating to the people that have died, specifically the families of the billionaires who have kind of made comments about them taking too long to confirm the deaths and this and that. But where's the confirmation? If any of you guys have any connection to that, I would love to see it, because that would help me feel more confident about some of this stuff, and that it's not potentially just something that's been kind of drummed up to, scare people or divert some kind of attention. But the fact that the sun was, the ruler of the chart at this time, and it's conjunct the moon, is saying like something is getting ready to grow. Now, ends of situations obviously is Mars, and so what we would have seen within a couple of days is that the moon would come into contact with Mars, but that wasn't for another 5 days. Now, likely that's probably right around the time that they were telling people, oh yeah, it's probably, imploded. But I'm really looking at the sun square Neptune, and Neptune being in the 8th house, and the fact that this is a chart where, outside of that square, the sun isn't really being aspected. It's not. We've got aspects with the moon. And whenever we see sun square Neptune, it's like we don't see something clearly, something's missing, something's kind of hazy. I wonder what's going to happen when we start to see oppositions and squares down the road when Mars goes into Virgo, but I'll give you guys those dates in a second. But like I said, Saturn retrograde in Pisces, right? It's about reviewing sea machines, things that go hidden, things that go missing. Now, I'm really curious looking at the Saturn degrees. So because Saturn is retrograding at a 7, I would like to read both 6 and 7 degrees of Pisces. And we're going to read the Sabian symbols and see what they say, if there's anything that's kind of touching on this in particular. So here is Pisces 6. Officers on dress parade. The keyword is discipline. The theme is practice and drill. The symbol speaks to respect for tradition and pride in personal responsibility. The image of officers on dress parade alludes to ritual, protocol, formality, rehearsal, and attempt to live up to an ideal. The emphasis on this degree is self-discipline, commitment, investment of time, energy, and personal self-improvement. On a practical level, it can apply to any public demonstration of skill and competency. At its highest, it represents accountability, confidence, and composure. Negative would be feelings of entitlement, attempts to get in one's way by pulling rank or demanding special treatment. The accent is on discipline and protocol. The possibility of being inspected or having your work looked at makes it important to put your best foot forward and follow the rules. Your great advantage lies in acting with dignity. Brush up on the rules and etiquette to make sure you know how to do what you're committed to doing. Guard against getting out of step with your fellows, insisting on doing your own thing. It's not a good time to act on impulse or fly by the seat of your pants. Responsibility, drama, display, protocol, formality, rules, discipline. So pretty much, I mean, that's been the biggest theme that's come out of this, is the fact that, like, you know, essentially what we're dealing with is this is a sub that was not in any way, shape, or form like regulated. Like, it wasn't anything that had to pass any type of inspection. That's probably the thing that, like, kind of concerns me the most about this, is that Saturn in this sense really does apply. It's like, is that what we get for not thoroughly making sure that there was proper protocols that were followed in regards to the ship in itself? Okay, so then we read Pisces 7. A cross lying on the rocks. The keyword is conscience. The theme is slippage. The symbol speaks to fear of personal rejection and blindly following the crowd in order to gain acceptance. The image of a cross lying on the rocks alludes to disillusion, disillusionment, a loss of faith, and abandonment of spiritual values. The emphasis in this degree is the importance of being true to the self, listening to the voice of conscience, thinking independently, and standing up for what's believed in, even when it isn't popular. At its highest, the symbol represents moral integrity, courage, refusal to compromise the self or lower personal standards in order to please others. Watch out for being spineless, giving up to the demands of others, and a tendency to be easily intimidated. The accent is on letting your conscience be your guide. You could easily make a clean break or sever ties. Guard against hanging on to what may be detrimental for your own best interests and the foolish interest of doing something is better than nothing. Abandonment, withdrawal, retraction, neglect, denial. I mean, I think in a number of ways, it really does make sense. I wonder if a situation like this serves as almost as a symbol or a lesson for being like, does it make sense to just be like, yeah, we're just going to do what we want. Like, we don't need to follow tradition. Why do that? What we're doing is fine. We've got it figured out. And then realizing whether it's because of lack of preparedness, not having the right captain on board, not having it, tested enough, not using the right materials, it ultimately leads to a situation like this, right? Now, when I compare this chart to JP Morgan, so we're going to put the JP Morgan chart on the outside. Was that the chart that I wanted to look at? No, it was the Titanic chart. We could look at this one too, but it is what it is. There's definitely, certainly some stuff here, but not as much as what I saw with, is it the sinking? Yeah, okay. So we put the Titanic sinking event chart on this, And something that piqued my interest was that it's in conjunction to Pluto in Gemini. So it's bringing up the themes of loss or death of groups of people. It also puts Chiron, Titanic's Chiron, on the Saturn, and it makes me wonder if this event is going to be used to limit the exposure of being able, like I said, to go and see that. It also puts the Titanic's moon in conjunction to the event Neptune. And we also see a North Node Chiron conjunction, a Saturn-Uranus conjunction. Not all that much different than the transits that we looked at when we looked at the Titanic sinking chart and some of the transits. But still, it comes through in this chart as well, as there being some kind of connection to death and loss and like groups of people that are being, unfortunately, you know, taken to the bottom of the ocean. Now, it's a bummer that we don't have like the chart of the sub. I wish that I could have found it, but I can't. But what I can tell you guys is this. In terms of like future transits that may kick up more information in regards to the submarine, or why the news was delayed, why it came out when it did, if there are other ulterior motives, I would be looking at these transits. For starters, I think the full moon that we're going to have in Pisces. Actually, there's two moons really. This moon, which is going to be the new moon in Leo, which is going to sit in conjunction to the ascendant and the point of fortune of the wreckage or the disconnection chart, I guess we should say, which will definitely bring some attention to that, I believe. And then the full moon in Pisces, which is going to be exactly on the Saturn retrograde degree of when the sub went missing. And we're going to see the sun in opposition to Saturn. So like who's responsible for it? Who made the calls in terms of what happened? Where are we finally like having memorials or things, you know, in honor of people who died at sea, Moon Saturn. I also feel like when Mars is in opposition to Saturn, we're going to hear more about this. Actually, when Mars opposes Saturn and Neptune. And we're going to hear more about like truth or facts coming out and people being like outraged about some of this stuff around July 21st. And then Mars is going to go through Virgo and it'll oppose Neptune. I speculate we might hear something right around here. August 18th through the 24th, and that's because Mars will oppose Neptune. And that's going to be about uncovering more, or they might find like more wreckage and they're like talking about it. Obviously all summer long, you know, Venus is going to be retrograde. So Venus will be going retrograde over the disconnection chart. Okay, so it'll be back and forth at 21 degrees. Actually, as I'm filming this, I filmed it the same day as I did my Venus-Uranus square, so that may be connected in some way, but Venus will square off with Uranus several times. But this will be the second square, right around early August, the 9th and the 10th. And then the Cazimi point, it looks like it's in conjunction to this ascendant. So I'm wondering if like the 9th through the 12th of August, that Venus retrograde is bringing more attention and shock and surprises in regards to what happened. And then finally, the sun in opposition to Saturn and the sun in opposition to Neptune. Now, those also could be periods where they're having memorials for those who were lost. Sun opposed Saturn, you know, at sea around the end of August, the 26th. And then when the sun makes an opposition to Neptune. And we know that when the sun opposes Neptune, it's also going to be, sorry, I'm probably throwing you guys all over the place. When the sun opposes Neptune, it's also going to be squaring the Pluto degree, right? Gemini of the sun here. But that's also where we saw the Titanic's Pluto. So right around September 19th-ish, we might see something there as well. I imagine these are all going to be the dates where there's going to be more that's going to come up about this. I mean, once again, kind of a bold statement, but I have a feeling, let me pull this chart up, because I was playing around with it a bit, because, you know, they said that they didn't lose connection until, where is it? I know I have it here somewhere. Give me 1 second, hold on. Imploded, is it here? Okay, I'll just plug it in. But they said that they heard the bang on the 19th, right, under the water. And they said it was shortly after they lost connection. Well, we know that they lost connection around 9:45. My guess is, I think it was at, I wrote this down. I think it was right around 10:41 a.m. And let me show you why I think that. So we know that it had to be within around that amount of time, although we can't totally trust the media, can we? St. John's, Canada. Okay. Okay, here. All right. So I played around with the time. I think it's around this time. So we know that it had to be after they lost connection, right? And when I kept moving the dial, it didn't seem, how do I put this? It didn't seem like it was bang on with it being a Leo rising. The only way it could be is if it was in the final moments, which would make the sun obviously be the ruler of the chart, and the sun is square Neptune, and it's also square the wreckage chart with Pluto and JP Morgan's Pluto as well, so I could see there being some kind of like correlation there. Was it that chart? Now I've got myself questioning. What was it with JP Morgan that it was squaring? No, it was just, I take that back. It was just the Titanics. There we go, right here. Moon Mars. Okay, so it's just the Titanic squaring. But when I was playing with the dial of like when it potentially could have been the minute or the time that the actual sub imploded, I came up with this Virgo rising chart because Leo rising didn't quite make sense. Working with Virgo rising, putting Mercury at the top part of the chart, and the fact that Mercury was not aspected, okay, like at all, like there's nothing here. It's not picking up a square. We don't see anything other than a slight sextile to Venus, but that's in the 12th house, so that's about something going missing. And it puts Gemini in an interception. Okay, so that means that the sun and Mercury are kind of like hidden, like it can't be found. And the sun rules the 12th house of what's missing. And if I were to go a couple minutes later, we were going to start to see the 11th house pick up Gemini. And then it would, yeah, then it wouldn't really kind of apply. And then when we go much later, like into Libra and stuff, when we look at like a Libra rising chart, that was going to be another about hour and a half, almost 2 hours later. That will bring Pluto to the 4th house, which I could see. But this just seemed like the one that made sense to me. I don't know. Those of you guys who are into astrology, I'd love to hear your guys' hot takes on this, because this is something that we'll probably not get confirmation on, especially considering the fact that apparently even the confirmation of the fact that the Navy heard the explosion in itself was like shocking, because they were like, yeah, we have stuff down there that can like monitor sounds that, you know, is like top secret, nobody knows about. But I picked this as the time because I think that makes the most sense. The Leo rising and the Libra rising just did not resonate. And I feel like once it gets later in the day, it's starting to kind of shift some of the planets. And I feel like this is definitely something that superiors knew, especially people who were like, you know, people who were high up in ranks within the Navy or within the forces involved, but they wanted to kind of keep this secret. I could also see if it was a little bit later, although I don't like it, but I like the intercepted Gemini, because that really makes sense that that was being kept a secret. We could see where if we tweaked it a little bit, Saturn would be dipping actually into the 6th house, but that would definitely make it more so a later degree Virgo. But that could be accidents involving ships if Saturn was in the 6th house. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just speculating, but you guys let me know. So what are my thoughts on all of this stuff? You know, obviously it's terrible, but studying charts historically, looking at patterns, being able to compare them, I mean, it's like a buffet for astrologers, because it really allows us to learn from experience and see how things play out in the world and relate it and be able to better make predictions astrologically with our sessions with our clients, to make predictions out in the world. I think really, you know, the Saturn retrograde is about knowing our limits when it comes to the ocean, okay? Like big time. I mean, we've got pods of orcas out there that are now learning to attack the fronts of ships, ramming the hulls of boats, and trying to take boats out. That kind of tells me that the ocean is fighting back, right? Saturn and Neptune both being in the sign of Pisces, there is definitely, we're going to start seeing our limits when it comes to the ocean and how far we can go, how deep we can go, how much we have to learn, where we need to be better about rules and regulations pertaining to exploring the ocean. Jupiter's the dispositor, and Jupiter's, you know, going through Taurus, and it's going to come into conjunction with Uranus. So we're going to see all kinds of travel and exploration over the next year or two just suddenly explode, whether it's in space or it's under the sea. I think also the Saturn retrograde, especially in this situation, is about honoring seasoned elders who know what they're doing, and not really caving to an agenda where we're being told, oh, you must hire people based off of these certain specs, and demanding it purely based off of wanting to have more diversity, right? In my mind, like a job and job qualifications and the ability to be hired for a job should be based off of experience, right? It should be based off of experience. It should be based off of knowledge and capability, which at times comes with age and work history. It's just kind of the way that it goes. It shouldn't be purely based off of needing to uphold some kind of age or race agenda. I'm sorry, but in this case, especially if some of these people who were either fired or cut loose because they wanted to bring people in who didn't have as much experience, clearly did not get them into the appropriate destination in which they were hoping to go. I mean, they got there, but now they're still there. And keep in mind that this is the first of several Saturn retrogrades. So we're going to have another 2 Saturn retrogrades over the next couple of years. And I'm really curious to see what happens when Saturn starts retrograding in potentially a square to Jupiter in Gemini next year, when it's, you know, coming into conjunction with Neptune. And I know that Saturn and Neptune will go into Aries and retrograde back into Pisces. And I definitely think that's going to be about knowing our limits, not just with the ocean, but just spiritually, also in terms of our health, our mental health. And I think we're going to start seeing where there's intentionally things being set up to create a sense of like false illusions or some kind of like imprisonment, right? Saturn and Neptune going into Aries, I think, is going to be about self-imposed imprisonment, whether that's wearing a headset and being like sucked into, you know, some kind of virtual reality world, or, you know, because of our lack of connection with other people, we're kind of isolating ourselves. That's going to be a couple years away, so we'll have to see how that plays out. And I think my big takeaway, you know, just going to the Titanic chart in itself, is I really genuinely do with, no, not that chart, with the wreckage chart, because that's where the Titanic now lays. I think that the Titanic wants to be left alone. And I think that we've learned now in several different situations that we probably don't have any business bothering what's down there. And I know that that sounds quite judgmental, and there are some people that will say, well, but, you know, don't we need to go down there and explore? Only if we have the wherewithal and the capabilities to do so safely. And I think that's what that's teaching us. And also that it maybe shouldn't be people who are going down there for the wrong reasons, that are in search of treasure or they're in search of some kind of adventure, but people who are down there who are doing the work that Saturn needs it to be doing. And I'm also hoping that if they are going down there, there's going to be more research into being able to have actual verification of factual evidence that the Titanic sank for the reason that it sank. You know, in the off chance that they're able to get into other parts of the ship and they're able to actually have evidence or get verification that there could have been other things that could have happened, I would imagine that there are certain financial institutions that probably would not want that information surfacing. They would not want it out there. So I'm going to kind of get ahead of the curve and tell you guys that if you happen to see that this ends up being something that's protected or, you know, taped off, or if they're saying people can't go there any longer, or that it's considered to be like a dangerous space, I will assume that that is the reason why, that they don't want some of the dots being connected as to whether, you know, 110 years ago it actually benefited them both financially in the long term, or in a sense of being able to swap out a ship or whatever else that you guys believe in. I don't really think that there's as much conspiracy around it as what it's been made out to be. I think that this to me seems like an energetic vortex that needs to and wants to be at the bottom of the sea. And those who may venture down there may be met with a very Moon-Pluto related fate. Let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear your guys' feedback. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of comments on this one, and a lot of people who have their theories. And I encourage you guys to go and do your research, look more into it. When you start to kind of connect the dots and see the eerily similarities of the fact that, you know, JP Morgan escaped one time, and it looks like they are also incredibly lucky with this delay of news over 100 years later, it starts to kind of make you wonder, you know. Leave me your comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you guys. I'll be back here tomorrow. We're going to be doing live readings on the channel. It's going to be live astrology readings. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure that you catch me this Sunday. Also, I'm going to be back with another astro weather. Until next time, I will see all of you guys very soon. Take care.